Coming to you from the shores of gorgeous Lake Michigan, welcome to the National Writers Series, celebrating 15 years as a continuous book festival and the premier home for passionate readers who love inspiring conversations with award-winning authors. Tonight, we welcome Scott Turow, an international icon and former practicing attorney who is the author of 13 best-selling works of fiction, including Innocent, 1L, and The Laws of Our Fathers. Presumed Guilty is his new novel and the sequel to Presumed Innocent, a book that redefined the legal thriller and served as the basis for Apple TV's most-watched drama series ever. The latest installment resurrects Turow's most famous character in Rusty Sabich, a career judge in the middle of retirement who is forced back into the courtroom for his most personal case yet, and a trial that will test his belief in a justice system he has devoted his life to. Our guest host tonight is David Baldacci, a best-selling author, storyteller, and literacy advocate whose books have sold over 150 million copies worldwide. The National Writers Series salutes our amazing audiences, dedicated volunteers, and generous supporters for helping us to raise the next generation of readers and writers through our free education programs across the region. Our season is made possible through major support by Green Brick Foundation, Northgard Technology Group, Golden Fowler Home Furnishings, Proud Financial Design, and Ward and Mary Bevins Gillette. Live streaming supported by Nancy Davey. Travel support provided by Traverse City Cherry Capital Airport. With major media sponsor Traverse City Record Eagle and major media partner Interlochen Public Radio. For information on future events, programs, and how to support our nonprofit work, visit nationalwriterseries.org. Please welcome two of our co-founders, New York Times bestselling author Doug Stanton and National Writers Series Executive Director Ann Stanton.
Hey, welcome. We're so excited about the event and so pleased that you are spending your night with the National Writers Series in Traverse City.
We're celebrating our 15th year of bringing together you and readers around the country with some of our favorite authors, and tonight we have two of the biggest blockbusters you can get. Mr. Turow's work has always been really compelling to a lot of us. It's about human fragility, about the search for justice and truth, and the new one is not to be missed.
So be sure to ask questions. Enjoy the show tonight. Bye.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. The National Writers Series presents an evening with Scott Turow and Presumed Guilty. I'm David Baldacci, and I've had this event on my calendar for a while, and I'm thrilled to be here. And I would like to welcome the guest of honor, the star of the show, Scott Turow.
Thank you, David. I would be remiss if I did not start by saying how truly honored I am that my friend David Baldacci agreed to do this. I'm a great admirer of David's as a writer and as a human being, and he knows it. But it's a very sweet, kind thing for him to do. He's got a lot of better things to do with his evenings than shoot questions at his friend. So thank you, Dave.
Well, listen, I can't think of a better way to spend my time than to hang out with you. We always have great conversations, and I'm just going to fanboy for a second. I read 1L before I went to law school, and it changed, I think, the way I viewed law school. I'd been only practicing for a year when Presumed Innocent came out. I was practicing in Washington, D.C. I had been writing short stories for a while, but never had attempted a novel. And that book blew me away, just like it blew America away. Everybody, I think, in this country was reading that novel when it came out. And not only was it inspirational for me, about 3 or 4 years later, I tried my first novel, to write my first novel. But you set a high bar, Scott, which is not a bad thing. And it pushes everybody to this day. And I just want to thank you personally for all the wonderful books you've written and all the wonderful things you've done with your life. I don't know how you continue to practice law all those years and turn out just spellbinding, compelling, complex work. There are very few people that can do that. So I would not want to be anywhere else than right here with you tonight. So Here we go.
Thank you, and probably the audience has heard enough incense swinging.
That's right. Okay. So when I read Presumed Guilty, you brought back Rusty, the iconic character from Presumed Innocent. So as a writer, I'd like to understand, one, what was your motivation to do that? What did you hope to achieve by bringing him back into this story?
Well, I had written about Rusty again, that actually more than once, but he had the feature role in a novel that I published 20 years after Presumed Innocent, called Innocent. Mm-hmm. And at the end of Innocent, Rusty, frankly, was shattered. His wife was gone. He was about to resign from his judicial position. He had just been released from the penitentiary. And although the last line of the novel is, "I'm interested in seeing what happens next," I thought he deserved better than where I had left him, particularly since Rusty, for the reasons you've already outlined, is sort of the man who changed my life. So, and like Rusty, I was interested in what happened next. And I know you have characters you've returned to, and you always keep them in mind. And now and then I would think about, wonder what's going on with Rusty up north. And so I mean, that was certainly the major precipitant, was that, I wanted to check in on this character and get a chance to reimagine his life.
A lot of people ask me some of the characters I brought back too, and just listening to you, it's evident that, Rusty is not merely a character you crafted on a piece of paper. He has deep meaning for you. I think he feels more real to you than not, maybe more real than some people in real life.
Certainly in greater depth than I know many people in my life.
And I read Innocent, and you must be the only writer who took an iconic character that, as you said, sort of, was the one who made you who you are today, and put him through that sort of story and into prison as well. I can't think of another writer who did that to a main character of theirs. And that took a lot of courage, I think. And I'm really glad you brought him back in this novel, because like you, I've been wondering what he's been up to as well. I always thought he would have a second and a third act as well. And I know in this novel, he's got some years on him. And it's like our characters age as we age. When I was writing my first novels, everybody was in their 30s. Now they're more like in their 50s and 60s. I think that's sort of a natural progression. So can you talk a little bit about, as the years have grafted onto him, as things have happened to him in his life, sometimes good, sometimes bad, what changed the dynamic in this story about that? Because he is at a certain age now, and he's seen a lot of life behind him.
Yeah, I mean, you can't ever leave the autobiography out of fiction. I mean, no matter how dramatically different from you characters are, I mean, what you know about being a human being most intimately is what your own experiences are. And for me, with not being a lot younger than Rusty, just a couple of years, I found this a particularly sweet time of life. I have a very happy marriage to Adrian. I've got 8 grandchildren and three kids, all of whom are in really good places. And some of my own sense that things have turned out well probably came to infect Rusty as well.
I really sensed in the novel too that Rusty was very much in a transitional space, someone new in his life, and new people in his life as well, that touched him, and obviously became intimately involved with several of them in the novel. Did you draw any particular experience when you were sort of crafting that novel as just things that sort of came together for the story, or were you just compelled to sort of put that framework of the story together to outline a point that you wanted to make throughout the novel? Because it was complex. It brought together pretty much the entire spectrum of human emotion that people can go through. Of course, 3 or 4 different characters in great depth. And I would really just want to understand how you sort of built that framework, because it was quite astounding.
Well, I had 2 other motive ideas. One was, and we haven't gotten you and Michelle out there, but maybe we will someday. We have a house in southern Wisconsin, and that's been a family house for more than 30 years. It's, the house my kids, spent their time off of school at, and while its principal use has been for family purposes, it's been impossible over the course of 3 decades not to observe the area around there. Our place is in the middle of a bunch of farms, literally. But it's very much as Presumed Guilty describes Gagan County. It's kind of the middle of the middle for America. And I was both sensitive to the sort of resentment some of my neighbors seem to feel about the degree to which they're ignored by the rest of America. We do tilt toward an urban suburban population in this country. And I thought, there's a lot that goes on out there, a lot of challenges that people are not aware of, just to take one, because the economic opportunities are not all that great. You're raising your children with the knowledge that they're in all likelihood going to move away. And that has all kinds of other social impacts. So I wanted to write about that. The other thing that's been on my mind for a long time is years and years ago, I read a novel by a friend in Chicago, Rose Ellen Brown, called Before and After. And Before and After was about what happened to a family when a son in the family was suspected of, I think he was murdering his girlfriend. And, it's a harrowing book. I loved it. And I told Rose Ellen that, that was the one book I'd read where I'd happily put aside my own work to write the screenplay if she had any interest. Fortunately, Barbette Schroeder, who made the movie, had better sense than to hire me to write the screenplay. But over the years, I've sort of kept track of that idea. And in my own practice, as a prosecutor and then as a defense lawyer, I became deeply aware of the fact that in most criminal cases, there are actually 2 families that are suffering. There is the family of the victim, and there is also the family of the defendant. And they all feel unmoored, and as if that they are or have endured enormous losses. So I needed a way to make the story my own. And, I'm sure, David, you're the same way. You get certain ideas that are like a flashing bulb, not flashing all that often, but every now and then it glows again, and you go, yeah, I got to get back to that. And so these 3 ideas: write about Rusty, write about an area much like Kenosha County in Wisconsin where I live, write about a family paying the toll of having somebody under suspicion. Those were all there. And then, frankly, when I got the idea that Rusty would return to the courtroom to defend this young man who is hopefully destined to become his stepson, that's when it all really began to come together for me.
Yeah, you did that beautifully and authentically. I didn't sense any false emotion throughout any of the characters' reactions, what was going on. It just seemed real. That this would be what people would be going through. And I know sometimes when you have a big trial that culminates and the courtroom and the verdict is out, you have one side that's, screaming for joy, and the other side is absolutely devastated. And you really, you brought that out. And also, obviously, there was issue of race in this novel as well that complicated it even further.
Something you about with real sensitivity. So
yes, well, and it's for me it was a page turner with incredible substance, and there's a difference. There are page turners that are a little fluffy. There are page turners that have more. Yours certainly was there, and I really felt like, even though I didn't have the same background as some of the characters in there, I felt like I had stood in their shoes and had walked around in their skin, as Harper Lee once said in her wonderful novel. And that's what great books do. It puts the reader in the moment and in the emotional flash of what's going on. I'd love for you to talk about, because this is always fascinating with you, the fact that you continue to practice law at a very high level, very demanding jobs, very demanding caseloads, and still turning out books. And people talk about how you balance your work life and all that, but can you speak, one, to how you managed to do that, and two, when did you get to the point when you would be working on a case and an idea for a book would come? Then how would you handle that? How would you sort of say, okay, I'm going to be doing this, however many hours a year, but I also have a book I want to write. And how did you lay that out? Because this has always fascinated me with you.
It's a long story, the evolution of my life as a both lawyer and writer. When Presumed Innocent was sold to Farrar, Straus and Giroux, Roger Straus III, who really was, I thought of as my publisher, even though his father was the famous guy with the Ascot and the Rolls Royce. And Raj took me out to lunch and he said, do me a favor. Don't change anything in your life for at least a year. I was just beginning to ride this rocket ship that was Presumed Innocent for me. And I thought that was great advice. And on top of everything else, even though I'd come to the end of my journey as a prosecutor, I really was eager to change sides and to learn something about civil litigation and to become a criminal defense lawyer, which was a role that I actually valued even while I was being a prosecutor. So I wanted to do it, but it became difficult to both write. And I was doing what I'd done while I was in AUSA, an assistant U.S. attorney, writing late on Sunday night, writing early in the mornings. By the time Presumed Innocent had come out, instead of half an hour on the commuter train, I gave myself an hour and a half. But weirdly, I had a very busy summer, the summer after Presumed Innocent was published. I tried 5 different cases, and I'd get up in the morning and I didn't know what case I was trying, but I knew I was on trial. And I was doing a private lawsuit because it involved a security system in Kansas City. And one of the lawyers on the other side said, God, Scott, it's weird. I just saw Presumed Innocent, the paperback of it downstairs in the drugstore. We were in a hotel. And I was like, and why this should have mattered to me, I cannot begin to tell you. But it was like, God, I haven't even been home to open the boxes that Warner Books has sent me, our mutual beloved publisher. And I didn't even know the paperback was coming out now. And it just, for whatever reason, it said to me, I was going to have to find a new balance in my life. So I went to my partners and I said, look, I want to practice less. I don't want to retire, but I want your say so for me to practice part-time. And before you answer, let me tell you that I want to spend a portion of my time doing, the work that the guy who went to law school thought he should be doing, particularly when he achieved a position of financial comfort. And the firm, there was a little pushback. Why don't you take 3 or 4 months off and every now and then? And I was like, I know me. I got to write every day to write a novel, and I want the time to do it. But I don't want to give up practice. Anyway, they were amenable to that, and I continued that routine with the time spent practicing, probably steadily declining till about 2020, when I finally retired from commercial practice. I took with me one remaining pro bono case. It's gone on and on, but it too will end someday. But I always enjoyed practicing law. I sometimes didn't enjoy the people on the other side. And sometimes you get in front of a judge you don't admire. And there's pressure from clients. There's, the deadlines can kill you in the practice. And, your David is shaking his head knowingly. But overall, I had great clients who understood the terms of my life. When they called me at home in the morning when I was writing, I knew it was important. And one of the things that I have going for me is that I do not need a cork-lined room to write. So, when they called, I would listen. Sometimes it was a long conversation. I'd write the follow-up emails that had to be written. And then almost miraculously, I could go back to what I was writing, even if it was the second half of a sentence that the first half of which was already committed to paper. So, I was well aware of the ethical restrictions on writing about my clients and my cases. And nobody has ever accused me of crossing that line, except when I've done it in nonfiction with my client's permission. But there's no doubt that being in the milieu of the law stimulated me, and was in many ways good for my writing. So the balance was always there. When a case was going to trial, there's no way to say, well, hold on, I got to finish this paragraph. Trial, as presumed guilty reflects, is a 1,000% commitment. And so everything got set aside, and, including, sadly, my wife and kids. So that was always the understanding. And I was always careful to caution, my female friends and partners who took great solace from the fact that I was able to practice part-time, from the fact that, having the other half of my responsibility be writing it's not like having a kid who you've got to pick up at 3:30 at school. There is no give in that schedule. And all I was saying to these usually women was, what you are doing is a lot harder than what I do, because you've got that primal call to your children to deal with. But I was very grateful to my partners at the Sonnenschein firm, now called Denton's, who tolerated my dual life for all those years. And but it worked, and I enjoyed it, and I had, not only was I having a blessed career as a novelist, but I had an extraordinary roll of the dice in the cases that I got. And I was able to serve on a number of public bodies in Illinois, including, the Death Penalty Commission, which was a remarkable educational experience for me. And as I've already said, I think two things fed each other.
As a lawyer, all we had in our quiver were words. And I joke sometimes, not completely joking, but some of the best fiction I ever wrote was when I was a lawyer. We both had the same trial record as the other side, and we just had to write it in a vastly different way and embellish certain things and oppress other things and tell a story that a jury or a judge could believe is really the true one, as opposed to the other side. And so the transition from being a lawyer to being a writer really didn't really change. And I love how you compartmentalize. I'm kind of a planes, trains, and automobiles guy too. I write everywhere, anywhere. I've written a lot of great stuff at a little Greek deli in the back near my office. And the perfect place to write is in your head, not necessarily a physical space. Now, I'd like to, because I didn't make the transition that you did from being a prosecutor to a defense lawyer. I'd love to hear sort of how that went. Did it go as you would expected? Were there some surprises? And did that give any type of fresh sort of prism for you on the stories that you wanted to write going forward?
Well, as I said, I was never one of those prosecutors who thought that defense lawyers were just an obstacle to a just outcome. And I always understood that the rules of the game were, can the prosecution prove the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? And I knew the burden was on me to do that. And I knew that if I was the defendant, I would be kicking and screaming and squirming, trying to save my life, whether I was guilty or not. And that's what the defense lawyer's job is, to punch holes in the government's case, to offer the defendant's point of view when it makes sense. The really interesting lesson I got, though, Dave, took place after I made this transition to part-timedness. And before I had gone out and left the U.S. Attorney's Office, there was a great criminal defense lawyer who was a dear friend of mine named Eddie Genson. And Eddie said, you got to just promise me one thing. You'll never plead an innocent guy guilty. And I thought, well, that's not very hard. And then I ended up with a pro bono case. My client was one of 4 men who was arrested for firebombing the back porch of one guy's girlfriend's house. And I don't know exactly what happened, but the worst case was that my client was in the car when this other guy decided to do that. And I believed in every legal sense he was innocent. When I came on the scene, he had been held, notwithstanding all of this, because it's a serious felony. He'd been held for 4 months in Cook County Jail without bond. And we got him out. We got him bail. I then proceeded to drive the prosecutors crazy by practicing law the way I believe it should be practiced, which is, every tool available. So I filed a motion to declare the Illinois aggravated arson statute unconstitutional. This was not an entirely frivolous motion. There were things to complain about. And of course, the prosecutors in a urban courtroom do not have time for these shenanigans answering motions on constitutional law. So they wanted to get rid of me, and they wanted to get rid of the case. And, my client wanted to be a firefighter. And if he pled guilty, he was going to have to abandon that dream. But the prosecutor said, we'll offer him a plea to time served We'll even reduce the offense, but it will be a felony, and that will keep him from ever joining the fire department. And I didn't make the decision, but I did present it to my client. He, with the strong encouragement of his family, who wanted him out and back to work, he decided that he was going to plead guilty. And I thought a lot about Eddie and what I had promised him. I actually talked to Eddie about the case eventually, but I realized how complicated defending cases is in a way that prosecuting cases sometimes is not. If you're prosecuting a case, you're going in one direction, and that is forward toward a goal, which is convicting the defendant. Never thought it was my business to sentence. I wasn't the sentencing authority in the federal courts. The judge was, but I just wanted to have the verdict that the defendant was guilty. Being a defense lawyer involves, you're part psychologist. You got to deal with the family as well as the defendant. You've got to be aware of how your client is bearing up physically and emotionally, because the weight of accusation is a lot. And of course, that was truer in the case of people accused of white collar offenses. My wonderful client, among many things to be said for him, is he'd lived in a terribly poor neighborhood his whole life and had never been arrested until this case. But he was aware of how that process worked. Everybody around him had been through it, including many family members. You take a white collar defendant who's told that he's probably going to get indicted, and that person justifiably says, my life is over. If this happens, I don't care what the verdict is. I can't walk around the streets of my town having been accused of, of a felony, particularly a felony involving, some kind of corruption or, one guy I'm thinking of in particular having defrauded the federal government. And again, that's a burden that you as a defense lawyer take on. I was fortunate that in the grand jury phase, working in the federal courts, many more of your clients walk away without being charged than I was aware of when I was on the other side. That's good, but their lives are irretrievably changed anyway. And saw a lawyer the other night, and he reminded me of a mutual client of ours. And this was at Phoenix, where I had gone to Oslo Books. And I remember this particular client was a wonderful man, but and he talked about how gung-ho he was about prosecuting, he thought all the crooks belonged in jail. And then when he was the focus of it, he suddenly thought, this is like being in Red China. I can't believe I have so few rights. So you learn a lot.
I got a great sense of that in Presumed Guilty, because I saw that in Rusty. I saw that other side of him, because he had great responsibility. What was going on with his client, the client's significant other, the client's family, and the woman he was in a relationship with, her family as well. And it was a whole nother level that, as you said, a prosecutor doesn't have to worry about that part, but it weighed heavily on every decision Rusty had to make, and also every decision that he had to present to his client as well. And it was such a back and forth sort of thing. The tension was so amazing. And again, it hit at such an authentic level that it really was spot on. And I just, again, was amazed at the level of skill in putting that together. Those scenes are difficult in any respect. The courtroom scenes, again, I don't think anyone does it better. I would like to hear your take on, research. Obviously, you've lived this life, as far as the legal technical issues that you have to build into a fictional story. And I love the part because I knew you had a house at the lake. And so we have a house on the lake in Virginia. And those details are incredible because I know this guy has walked the walk. He's paddled that kayak. He's done all this stuff. He knows what he's talking about because the little details you focused on were the ones I would focus on if I were going to write that. It was just perfect. But the courtroom scenes were seamless. They hit the cues, they hit their marks, moved on quickly. I know you could have said a lot more, but I sort of sense you going through this going, I'm not writing a treatise. I'm not writing a nonfiction book that a law student is going to have to memorize half of to pass the bar or get an A in the class. But it was almost like you only left what the reader needed to experience in that novel. And you cut your ego off and said, look, I know a lot more, but I'm not putting it in because it doesn't have to be there. Can you sort of talk about that process a little bit?
Yeah. Like all of your questions, there's a lot to say by way of response. But, I started my life as a creative writing fellow at Stanford after college. And then I taught out there for a few years. And then I really discovered that I was much more passionate about law, as I was living it through my friends who were lawyers, than I was about English criticism. And so I made this decision to make this U-turn and and go to law school. But one of the things that had bedeviled my time at Stanford was I wasn't even sure about, what the purpose of the novel was and what should the goals of the artist be. And finally, near the time I left, I thought, well, I really think a great novel is one that can be read and enjoyed by both an English professor and a bus driver. And that the purpose of art, to the greatest extent possible, is to create universals, to draw people together as they behold the experience of another human being. And when I was standing in a criminal courtroom one day, actually had gone up to supervise a couple of younger lawyers, I turned around during a lull in the proceedings, and I looked, and it just happened to be one of those days where the court buffs, the spectators, the people who came for the entertainment of the trial, were just remarkably diverse cross-section of the people in Chicago. There were lawyers who were between court calls. There were, there were elderly folks who often, turned to the courthouse for entertainment. There were all kinds of people there. And I suddenly said to myself, holy smokes, you want to talk about a subject where the bus driver and the English professor can both be interested. This is it. Crime and criminality and the pursuit of the wrongdoer and the rules and the means of establishing facts in a courtroom. All of that. That's a subject to write about. And I've never lost that appreciation for what goes on in the courtroom. I am a law nerd. You can plunk me down in a courtroom anywhere, and I promise you within 5 minutes, I'll be fascinated by what is going on. And my attitude in writing Presumed Guilty was that I wanted to maintain a level of authenticity, but principally so that readers would understand the actual excitement that goes on day by day in trying a lawsuit. And yes, there are a lot of what seem to be tiresome arguments between the lawyers where they're just bickering with each other. But there are dramatic stakes often. And, to some extent, David, I stood on, the shoulders of people like you who've, detailed the legal process in some of your books. And, through 150 million copies, have made people more aware of, of what the legal and the investigative process is. And so, I felt I could be a little more detailed in presumed guilty than I felt I could be in presumed innocent. And, but you're right, it's a balancing act. You want to create the authentic feel of the courtroom. You want to get what's exciting about what's happening there. But you never want to be boring, either as a trial lawyer or a novelist.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the two books, because Presumed Innocent, I think, came out in like 1988. And it was a fantastic book, but it was also a fantastic police procedural. I still remember reading passages about how the detectives do their work, how they communicate with the prosecutors, how they collect evidence. But 88 was, in 2025 is light years, difference as far as forensics. And Presumed Guilty, there was a whole nother layer of forensic that didn't even exist
Right.
during the time you were Presumed Innocent. And I've always maintained that the crime rate in this country would plummet if every American citizen had to watch a year's worth of episodes of Forensic Files, because they know they would never get away with it. They're always going to screw up, and nobody's that smart. But so when I remember reading Presumed Innocent and just being fascinated by those technical details that I really knew very little about. And then fast forward to Presumed Guilty, where there's a whole nother layer of things going on, everything from just the minutiae of what they can do to collect evidence, DNA, everything else that goes along with that. So that must have been quite a ride for you, having written books on bookended books on both sides of the forensic sort of evolution that's taken place.
Right. We may talk about the TV series that was made from Presumed Innocent. And when David Kelly first called me about it, and I've known David for a long time, he said, it's 37 years, we're going to have to make some changes. And I interrupted him. I said, you're darn right you're going to have to make changes. Presumed Innocent was written before DNA had made its forceful entry into the courtroom. And the reality today is, if you remember the facts of Presumed Innocent, Rusty Sabich's trial would be nothing more than what the lawyers call a slow plea. He would be hopeless. He would have been perfectly framed, as it would have turned out. So that was just the beginning of what had to change in presenting the same book today. And you're completely right that the forensic gets more detailed. And, I'd had a lot of exposure to shoe print evidence because it had been involved in one of the murder cases that I handled. But cell phone technology, which becomes a big part of the evidence in Presumed Guilty, I didn't know anything about that. I had no idea how far a cell signal could carry. The great thing, of course, is that, we have just an immense amount of information at our fingertips with the internet. But I still had to dedicate a lot of time to impression evidence and cell technology and stuff like that. And again, you want to present it in a way that the reader is going to feel informed and not, bored. You never want a reader to feel that they're just putting up with what the author wants to tell them.
Well, I think that, in both books, and certainly Presumed Guilty, I obviously read much more recently, you tied it to the high stakes of the case. It wasn't just, you weren't just reciting facts. You were trying to intertwine it with, here's what this means, and here's what it means to you. And this is how it's going to impact the case. And because tying those two things together, I never felt like anything dragged in the novel, because, the science will impact, the law, and that the law will impact what might happen to your client or might not happen to your client. So I had no issue or problem with that at all. I thought it was just absolutely seamless. And I'm glad you brought up the TV series. Obviously having Kelly as part of it, who has written some of the greatest legal stuff out there. It's on the small screen. Can you talk about that? How it came about, and what your relationship was with it, and your involvement, and what you thought of it.
Well, weirdly, and I think what must have set this off was the Perry Mason series on HBO.
Okay.
But 3 different producers called me within a period of 6 weeks about, well, it's time to revive Presumed Innocent. And one of them was a young man who had been a close friend in college of one of my college roommates' children. So he came with, incredible bona fides, because Dusty Thomason's a friend of the Checky family, and Al is my dear friend and college roommate. And Dusty at that point was a chief lieutenant for J.J. Abrams and his company, Bad Robot. And I'd barely finished that conversation with him when David Kelly called. I called my agent at CAA. And of course, between J.J. Abrams and David Kelly, you got 2 of the bigger names in television. And I just envisioned Bruce sort of running around his office going, oi, 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 what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And eventually they agreed to combine forces, which worked very well for me. My role was, I was supposedly the co-executive producer of the show. And I say supposedly, not because I didn't read every script they sent me, not because I didn't give them notes, but because I am one of those people who does really respect the difference between writing novels and making films. And so I tried to contribute what I could, but, it wasn't much, and it wasn't attended to. And I took no offense from that. Because, I'd gotten to know Dusty Thomason. He's just a remarkable guy, great writer in his own right. And I'd known David since he showed up probably 25 years ago, David, and performed the same role that you're performing tonight when I came to LA and to talk about one of my novels. So, and he's very humble, decent, down-to-earth human being, and whom I like a lot. And at one point, he called me and asked me to work with him on a series that he was developing. So we've had a lot of contact over the years, and I had just had a lot of faith in the work that he's done. So he solved the DNA problem with the brilliant end of the first episode of Presumed Innocent, where instead it turns out that Carolyn is pregnant with Rusty's child. And that's just typical of David Kelly. He's he really is a genius at what he does. And it was fun to watch him work. Did I agree with everything? No. Of course, I've been around that barn, fortunately for me, more than once. But as I said, I accepted from the beginning that there was going to have to be changes, and that made it easier for me. Adrian and I went to the set. We had the usual fun of meeting the actors and watching them do what they do, which is always a really neat experience, as long as you don't have to stay there too long, because you know this from your own experience.
Yeah, hurry up and wait. It's
right.
It can be a little tedious.
Right.
People come and they ask me sometimes, I have a film deal and I really, I want to have a lot of control over it. And I said, look, my simple rule is you never want to have so much control over a film or TV project, thus that if it fails, they can blame and then sue you.
Yeah.
So being an executive producer with consulting rights is perfectly fine.
Well, it's, I tell people who say they want to control what happens to their book, I said, I'll give you a way to have perfect control. Don't negotiate the check they give you. It'll be you have complete control over it. But the other consolation I offer to other writers is, look, no matter what they do, it's not going to change a word of the book that you wrote.
Right.
And yeah, it's a powerful medium, so much so that when I think of Rusty, it's hard for me not to see Harrison Ford's face. But your book will remain. And if they make a good film, as has happened to me twice with regard to Presumed Innocent, you're going to have a much wider audience introduced to your work. And hopefully, if a good job is done, and has been done in that case twice, with an appreciation of the story you wrote. There are plenty of people who are going to watch the Presumed Innocent TV series who, sadly, in my judgment, and I suspect yours, will not pick up a book, in the next year. But at least you have reached them. And that's satisfying, when you're talking about something that, I dreamt up on the morning commuter train and, finished writing in my basement. So, but the Presumed Innocent series I liked a lot. And I thought David did a really good job, and he got at some things in the series that Alan Pakula, couldn't approach in the film because of, the difference in the time periods.
I thought it was wonderful. And as we both know, other writers who had this happen to them, they've come out a lot worse at the end as well.
Yeah.
No room to complain. I'll ask you one more question, and then we've got some questions in the queue from the audience. What's next for you? I'm always curious about that.
Well, I've started a new book. I'm working on it with the deliberation that comes from being off on book tour. But an elderly lawyer is reading the obituaries as he explains to one of his relatives. He reads the obituaries every day because it's the only place where the people he knows now make news. And he is shocked to find an obituary for a man whom he, the lawyer, thought had been murdered 50 years ago by one of the lawyer's clients. And so that's the beginning of this book. And, I have a sense of what I think I'm writing about. We'll, as always is the case, we'll see how it turns out.
Well, it's a hell of a hook. I like that a lot. All right, let's go look at some of the questions we have coming in. This is from Melanie in Detroit. Who is the greatest lawyer ever, and can you pick real or fictional, I guess, in your judgment?
Well, he almost has fictional stature, and that would be Clarence Darrow, who was, the basis of the Spencer Tracy character in Inherit the Wind, and who, defended Leopold and Loeb in Chicago and spared them from the death penalty for the really gruesome murder of their cousin, Bobby Frank. So, and by all accounts, of course, Darrow was also quite a rascal. So he's a fascinating figure, brilliant, sometimes unscrupulous, but with a pretty much unrivaled record of success, given the cases he was trying and the times in which he was doing it. So I guess I'd have to nod toward Darrow. I once tried to do a TV series about Darrow. Of course, given the world of television, he was going to come back as a ghost, but it didn't get that far.
This is from Aaron in Traverse City. Is there one unsolved mystery or crime that you are obsessed obsessed with or would like to solve?
Well, it's had a lot of publicity, but I am still curious about the John Benet Ramsey case, and most of the people in law enforcement whom I know feel that family was really put through the ringer. The other one is a crime that really formed the basis for my novel Identical, which ironically is in development now for a limited series. But and that was the murder of Charles Percy's daughter, Valerie. And Valerie Percy was she was a twin. And somehow somebody came in the house and murdered Valerie Percy, while Chuck Percy, the dad, was a candidate. I think he was running at that point for the United States Senate. Percy had run for governor and run for the Senate, but he ultimately became the senator from Illinois. But that's an incredible mystery of how that had happened. And I've heard all kinds of law enforcement speculation over the years. But it remains a continuing grief to the surviving sister, who is Sharon Rockefeller, the wife of Jay Rockefeller of West Virginia.
Desiree in Grand Rapids says, you talked a lot about walking away from your famous lead character. Do you really think you'll ever stop thinking about Rusty? And she also adds, by the way, she'll read any book you still have in you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I'll think about Rusty, but this book came 15 years after Innocent. I'd have to live to 90 and still be writing at full power, which is a lot to ask, even to go back on my own timetable. More than that, I'm happy with where I've left Rusty, and I'm happy with the overall meaning of his saga. So I'm probably not inclined to ever go back to Rusty again. That's not to say in Turow fashion, because these characters circulate through the background of other books. I'm not saying Rusty won't make a cameo here and there, but he's not going to be the center of another book, at least as I understand my own intentions today.
He's had a fantastic arc, and I think you, in some ways, really brought him full circle and gave him a full, rich life. We saw him, many facets of him, and we saw differences in him as he changed as time went on. As time, grafts onto all of us things. So he was a splendid example of just being alive, and having lived for such a long period of time. Stella in Northport wants to know, what does a writer read to relax? Is that even possible?
When I am a reader, I am a reader. I judge things by whether or not I can sink into the story and suspend my disbelief. And, I happen to be in one of those periods where I'm reading a lot. I met a young author up in Kenosha, Wisconsin, named Hannah Morrissey, and I'm reading Hannah's first novel now. She was recommended by my friend David Ellis, who's a very fine crime writer in his own right, also an appellate court judge. Talk about tough act dividing your time. But, there's a book where Traverse City and its environs plays a large role, which is to say Tom Lake by Ann Patchett, that really, captivated me. I thought it was terrific, and I ended up doing what I sometimes do, which is I had an ebook, I had a physical book, I was listening to it in the car. It was, it was a lovely reading experience. I read a book that had a similar hold on me a few months before that, called Beasting, by an Irish writer named Paul Murray, and he's quite a large talent. So, and I mean, and the truth of the matter is that, if I ran downstairs and looked among the shelves, I'd probably have 3 or 4 other books that I've read recently that I would want to mention. But that's what's kind of in mind right now.
I think the one common theme among all writers is that we really started out as readers, and then, the magic of books and storytelling, it gets in your blood. And if you have the desire and the, fire belly and a skill set that you want to make that a career, I think it all starts with being a reader. And it becomes a lifelong sort of obsession. God knows the world would be a much better place if we had more people who read books consistently,
And I mean, if frankly you're lucky, your first experience of stories and literature is being read to, which is why I think, audiobooks have such a hold on people, because it touches an experience that they've had their whole lives.
I completely agree. I think audio is, one thing, it's tied to this that everybody carries around. So you can listen to it anywhere you want to be. And
Right.
it gets more people reading. I don't care how they read. They can listen to it. They can read an ebook. They can read a physical book. So long as they're diving into storytelling, it just makes for better people, more empathetic people. You get a chance to walk in. Some people, I like to say, reading is like traveling the world without a plane ticket or a passport.
Right.
You get to see people from all over, and you get to walk around in their skin and understand them. And all of a sudden, the boogeyman argument, the other argument, no longer works against you.
Right. When what you were saying, David, before, is something that I often emphasize, which is the bedrock of our moral consciousness is narrative and stories, where we are allowed to experience the world as other people experience it. And it becomes the bedrock of doing unto others as we would have them do unto us, because we get the experience of seeing the world as they see it.
Yes. No, it's absolutely right. Well said on that. So, Brian, in Indianapolis, crime thrillers and legal dramas are bigger than ever, with new kinds of storytelling and podcasts and no end in sight for people's obsession. What do you think it is that hooks so many people as a genre? And is there any end in sight? I hope not.
We both hope. And Baldacci is bigger than I am, so he hopes even harder than I do. When I had that epiphanal moment in the courtroom in Chicago, what I realized is that crime is a theme that is eternal. And I think it's as simple as the fact that we all understand the impulse toward deviation. And we want to know what the hell motivates somebody to break the rules that I think about breaking, but actually don't break. And because that impulse lives in all of us, we take a certain amount of comfort from knowing that, crime never pays. What David was saying before about, the studying forensic files and realizing you're going to get caught. So, crime just touches really basic impulses about being in society, being among other human beings. And, it's going to be going, certainly detection's going to be a whole different business, but there'll still be crime stories 100 years from now. I'm confident of that.
We have one last question. I think it's a great one to end on. This is from Sarah in Traverse City. We have so many young writers here in Northern Michigan and so many great programs for them to explore their talents. If you were to give your younger self just one practical bit of advice now, and obviously for them as well, what would it be?
Well, I have a lot to say on that score. First, to the cohort of people who are listening out there who want to know, well, how do I end up where Baldacci and Turow are? You will never get there unless you write. Writers write. If you write, you are a writer, and if you don't, you aren't. And it's that simple. To those who have crossed that Rubicon and have committed themselves to trying, the other thing I like to caution them about is that everybody I have seen succeed in the arts, with very few exceptions, has demonstrated not just a talent for the particular art that they're practicing, whether it's music or drama or sculpture. They have also demonstrated an ability to take a punch and to get up again. And that's usually what it requires in order to succeed. I had 4 unpublished novels before I wrote Presumed Innocent. And some of them were at the bad time. Some of them were just imperfect. And, it's hard to fail. Hardest, frankly, to have that feeling within that you haven't done it yet. You're trying, and that's what bedeviled me when I was at Stanford. I was trying like hell, but what was coming out of me wasn't right. And so that's, even before you get the rejection slips, it can be hard to reject yourself, but you have to have the strength, the commitment, and the passion to keep going, because that's what it takes. And I've seen that proven, dozens, if not hundreds of times.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think the passion, it's like body armor, over you. And then when the rejection comes, it's going to sting, but it's not going to be a mortal blow. If you don't have that passion and you're in it for another reason, that first rejection, cruel as it may be, will kill you.
Right.
And you'll go off and do something else.
Right. I mean, if you can't take the ego blow of being rejected, maybe you shouldn't start writing in the first place. It just has to be something where, frankly, people can't stop you, where you need to do it. And but if you do that, you're a writer. If you write, you're a writer.
I agree. Well, I want to thank the audience for tuning in tonight. Scott, thank you so much as always. This has been a great learning, lesson for me. And I could just talk to you for hours and hours. I always am thrilled being around you, and it's wonderful. It makes me feel better there are guys out there like you doing what you're doing.
Well, the world should know what a fine human being David Baldacci is, as well as what a fine writer he is. Because I'm really proud to be able to say that you're a friend of mine, and you're being here tonight and being willing to play the role of interlocutor when you're so often deservedly the star of the show is just a great kindness on your part.
Well, it was a thrill. Tell Adria I said hello. Hope we see you guys soon, and have a great rest of the year.
Thanks, David.
Okay, take care.
Thank you for joining us for this special presentation from National Writers Series. Next up on Thursday, March 13th at 7 p.m., tune in or join us in person when Jonathan Eig will take the City Opera House stage to talk about his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, King, A Life, the first major biography written in decades about the civil rights icon Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Tickets are available now. Go to nationalwriterseries.org.